I start entering. So welcome everyone. I'm Lauren Skronsky from Sustainable Jersey. I'm the Program Director for Community Engagement. Welcome to this 2021 Sustainability Summit. This is the panel discussion on Kiss the Ground. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. As an attendee, you're muted, and we ask that you stay that way until and if you're called on. We're going to have time for Q&A, and you might be called on to, sort of expand upon your question, or if the audience stays small enough, we can always just unmute you and maybe have you ask your question. We'll see when the time comes. I also want to let you know that, we wanted to keep this informal for Q&A. And so the speakers are sort of mixed in with you all. And so in order to, sort of highlight their videos, we just ask that unless you're asked to speak, if you could turn your camera off, that also helps with bandwidth for some people who have limited bandwidth to be able to have less cameras going. But you can also do a speaker view by putting your cursor up in the top right corner and click on the view button and then click speaker view. And that way, whoever's speaking at the time will be highlighted on your computer screen once I stop sharing my slides. And that'll give you, a better understanding of who's speaking, and you don't have to sort of sort through all of the video cameras. Also, we are providing a live transcript for tonight. And so if you're already seeing the closed captioning, great. If you're not, what you have to do is click the live transcript button down at the bottom of your screen. If you kind of hover your cursor over the bottom, it will, or maybe your control panel is at the top, click that live transcript button and then click show subtitle. If you're seeing the closed captioning across your screen and you don't want to, just do that same steps. And I think it will say hide subtitle, and that will remove those wordings. So we're also recording this session. And so all of the recordings for the events for the Sustainability Summit will be up online next week on the Sustainable Jersey website. So before we get started, I just wanted to thank our sponsors. Without them, this week-long event wouldn't be possible. You can see our summit sponsors listed here on the slide, and also our program underwriters who help to keep Sustainable Jersey going on an ongoing basis: New Jersey's Clean Energy Program, the Dodge Foundation, New Jersey School Boards Association. Thank you so much for all of your support. So everyone was sent a link to watch Kiss the Ground before tonight, and we hope that you were able to view the documentary, because we really have a great lineup of speakers, panelists who are scientists and conservation and regenerative agriculture practitioners who are all working on implementing some of the solutions that were addressed in the film. So we're really excited to hear from them all. You could see everybody listed here. The discussion is going to be moderated by the wonderful Margaret Waldock from Duke Farms, formerly of the Dodge Foundation. Some of you may remember Margaret from there. If you're in the nonprofit world in New Jersey, you probably have come across Margaret in your work. And Margaret will have some questions planned for the panelists, and then we'll also pepper in your questions throughout the evening. So again, you can ask your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to add them to the queue. And now I'm going to turn it over to Margaret to start the discussion.
Thank you, Lauren. That's a great intro. It's great to be here tonight, and looking forward to the conversation. So I trust that everyone who's joined us tonight has had a chance to view the film, Kiss the Ground, and be really curious to hear from our panelists and their sort of opinions about it, and also how it relates to their work, but also have a chance to hear from all of you questions that came up for you while you were viewing it. So what did we learn from this film? Well, I learned that soil is alive. It is a unique and complex system, and that this technology that has existed for millions of years, the photosynthesis of plants working with microorganisms, can support the sequestration of carbon in our soil, pulling carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it and storing it in our soil. I also learned that a lot of the practices of industrialized agriculture, chemicals, pesticides, tilling, can really disrupt this system and has significant environmental and public health impacts, including increasing desertification and significant micro and macro climate impacts. So healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy humans, healthy planet. This sounds really simple, and yet we know it's very complicated. So how are we going to get these natural systems solutions to the climate crisis to scale? Who are the stakeholders in this system, and what do they need to implement these regenerative practices at a global scale? And how are we going to balance all the tensions in the system, right, between people, economic drivers, biodiversity, the environment? And the big one, even if we are successful in this, is this enough to reverse the collapse of our climate? So the narrator to the film reminds us that in every fight that seems unwinnable, there are those who refuse to give up. And I know that this group of panelists are among those who refuse to give up. So I am going to, and I also am among those who refuse to give up. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Their titles are up here, but I just want you to hear in their own voice, you know, who they are. So let's start with you, Tom.
Good evening, everybody. I am Tom Omendinger. As you can see, I'm the Director of Natural Resources and AgroEcology here at Duke Farms. You might wonder why a person who is actually a certified ecologist and studied ecology would be running a farm. It's because we really want to look at the farming system here at Duke Farms as from the ecological processes and mimic those. We don't know any better than nature does itself, so that's kind of why I became in charge of the farming situation at Duke Farms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Great, thank you. How about you next, Stephanie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Murphy. I run the soil testing lab at Rutgers University, New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. And I've been doing that for over 20 years. I also teach at the university, basic soils course, and participate in various types of research anything related to soil, and all kinds of outreach efforts. Again, anything related to soil, I'm in. So, and I like to participate in other programs and organizations that have soil as the focus, soil care, land care.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. When we were doing the prep for this, you seemed very excited that soil was getting so much attention. So we're
That's right.
Focusing on soil tonight. Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Tober. I am the farm manager at Rancocas Creek Farm down in Southampton, New Jersey. It's a new farm project that we started just over a year ago. Prior to that, I was at Fernbrook Farm, CSA, for 13 years in Chesterfield, and as a farm apprentice in Massachusetts prior to that. And thank you, Lauren and Margaret, for having me on the panel. Very excited.
Great to have you, a farmer, on the panel. And then Karina, you're up next.
Thank you. My name is Karina Schaefer. I'm a professor at Rutgers, Newark, and I have been conducting research in climate change and carbon sequestration over 20 years, and it's very dear to me, and I'm excited to rectify some of the misconceptions that sometimes exist about natural-based solutions.
Yes, thank you. Well, great. I realize I did not introduce myself formally at the top of this. I am Margaret Waldock. I am the executive director here at Duke Farms. For those of you who don't know about Duke Farms, 2,700 acres of forest, farmland, natural area, parkland in Hillsborough, New Jersey. And our mission is to be models for environmental stewardship and to inspire a stewardship ethos in others. So with that, let's start off with this big question here. So you all saw the film. So I'm curious what our panelists thought the film got right and where you think the film may have missed the mark. Who wants to start us off with that?
Okay, I'll start. I think they had a good point that they looked back at history, civilizations for way back, and we realized that some of the decline of some of the great civilizations was related to the decline of the soils, their management of soils that depleted the soils or eroded the soils. And there's a cascading effect of what happens when you lose your food source, basically, or and the social unrest that can occur because of scarcity of food and competition for good land and so forth. So that's always important to recognize. I think they did a good job of showing, that soil is, we say soil is alive, recognizing that there's so much life, that the underground is its own ecosystem in a sense, connected above ground, of course, but there's a whole characteristic food web underneath the ground, and how that depends on that photosynthesis that's pulling that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and down into the soil. And that's the whole thing that we're kind of focusing on here as one of those things that we can do to help solve the overabundance of CO2 in the atmosphere. Anybody want else jump in, or I'll just keep going?
Stephanie, when we were talking earlier, you made a really good point though about the the farmer in this story and scenario. And Jeff, maybe you can weigh in on this too. The film rightly points to a lot of the damaging practices in this current modern agricultural sector. But what how did we get to that point, and where is the farmer fit in all of this?
Well, I will say, Jeff, if you want to jump in, that's great too. But I will say that we recognize that, when we started tilling the soil, there was a good reason that farmers tilled the soil. And it's not just to plant the seed. There were other reasons for that. And so it's not that the farmer, needs something else to do, or, enjoys getting out there on his tractor and driving back and forth on his field. There are actual reasons for that. And we also, didn't realize at first those, the long-term effects of what was happening. The incremental changes were so small from, say, year to year that you don't realize the damage that's occurring to the soil until it becomes, really damaged. Then we can start seeing the problem and recognizing that, oh, we shouldn't have been doing this all these years. So I think that's something important to recognize, that sometimes we put too much blame, in history on what was happening before, but farmers certainly never tilled the soil or put down pesticides, recognizing that they were doing so much damage. And what do you think, Jeff?
Yeah. Boy, there's so much to think about and talk about. I think one thing that I thought it was a great film in general, because it's such a large, sort of complicated subject. Remember in the beginning, they were asking people on the street, what are you doing about climate change?
Yes.
You're like, oh, I'm not using plastic straws. I think that we're starting from such a point that a lot of people getting through their day-by-day life are not thinking much about climate change. And I think the film maybe could have focused a little bit more on, you vote with your dollars, and how can you can do more than just spend, obviously, but how can your spending, because that's one of the quickest ways to affect change sometimes, affect a positive change that can help farmers reduce climate change, sequester carbon. And I think also they maybe should have talked more about the fact that the US government has been paying farmers literally to grow commodity crops that are done on huge scales with, large machinery and that kind of thing. And that's, Stephanie's point, how did we get here? That's one of the reasons. But anyway, it's funny because I think that sometimes as a society, we're much better at dealing with visceral problems like September 11th and Pearl Harbor. And, it's something that can unite us and we just can't look away from and we can't ignore. And I think part of the problem with climate change is I wish we could see CO2 going into the atmosphere. Like that map they showed of,
Yes.
tilling season and the corresponding CO2 clouds. Man, I wish as personally, every time I till the ground, I could see the CO2 going into the atmosphere because that would help me. And I think that's how this is like an invisible problem in a sense. And how can we convince people of the severity and show them that there are solutions that they can be a part of?
Yeah.
That's one of the things we're really fighting here, I think.
Yeah. So Tom, I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that, because that is certainly part of what your job here is at Duke Farms, right? If you could talk a little bit about how the land stewardship practices and the agroecology practices here is a way to be that point of demonstration.
Yeah, so about 20 years ago when I started here, we have about 1,100 acres that were considered agricultural grasslands, and we hayed the heck out of them. We made square bales. We sold them to hay farms across the region, but the soils got depleted. And as Stephanie and Karina are doing soil sampling at Duke, they're noticing that we have very shallow soils. So there's been a lot of extractive farming going on here for decades. And the way we try to turn that around is by saying, again, looking at the environment, the natural world, the ecology, saying, well, how did these grasslands in the Midwest, evolve? Well, with large herbivores coming through and eating. So I started doing research in the Midwest, and they've been doing a lot of rotational grazing for grassland birds, which are threatened and endangered species, breeding on these properties. And instead of haying them, which created a negative population sink for them because we were chopping up their nests while they were trying to breed, we delay mowed for a while, but the real farmer can't do that. So as a demonstration, we started figuring, well, maybe we can do some rotational grazing here, improve the pastures from the soil perspective, from the vegetation perspective, and keep those birds where they are, and provide a model and a demonstration of what hay farmers in the region may be able to transition to. So we're looking at that right now. We're in probably our 5th or 6th year. We have about 100 head that we pasture on about 200 acres or so, with about 900 more acres to try to graze, but that's a long ways away.
Yeah, I was struck by the comment by Alan Savory in the film about the rotational grazing that he was doing and how, you won't ever really see cows there because they're moving them around, as part of their rotational planning. And it just reminded me of Duke Farms, right? Because not a lot of people know we have rotational grazing happening here. That was very interesting. So Karina, I'm curious, started out saying that part of what your life's work has been on really kind of addressing misinformation and misunderstanding about climate change. So I'm curious what your response to the film was, what you think they got right and where you think they may have missed the mark.
What I certainly got right in the movie is that the things we are doing right now is not sustainable. Since I also teach sustainability, this is a huge issue. And this is Sustainable Jersey, obviously, that is hosting this. But how we change or where we need to go is still a little bit simplified. What they had, it is maybe a solution, but not the solution to go down the regenerative agriculture route. They also a little bit touched upon it, but misappropriated also the fact that this has been for indigenous people a long practice. Mm-hmm. Some of the co-benefits for grazing actually is the fact that cows, when they're eating grass, will emit less methane than if they are on the cattle farm where they are fed grain, such as corn, which they are not meant to eat. So there's a co-benefits to get back to the ecological health, not only of the soil, but also of the organisms on top of it, which is the cattle. Likewise, another little bit of a simplification here is the longevity or the time it will take. Yes, it will take time. It will take carbon out of the atmosphere, but it will be taking a long, long time. And as Jeff perhaps will know from his farm, it will take a long time to go from a conventional to an organic farm and actually start sequestering carbon. So it's not something that's a quick short-term solution to really draw all the carbon out. It is something that we have to plan for in a long term. And again, and another tidbit that was not touched upon, and we could already get to save more land, pesticide use, and anything else that is associated with it, is the fact that we are wasting 30 to 40% of our food. This is already an enormous amount that is produced that doesn't need to be produced if you wish. So we have already the capacity to reduce the burden on soils or land by simply not wasting.
Right. They only talk about food waste in the film in the context of compost, right? Not in the context of how much are we producing, or what the distribution of that food is, right? Because it seems like there's also a distribution problem with food.
Yeah, one more that I certainly would add is that we probably converting these large ag farms is going to be cumbersome. And some of the resources that I believe will be shared later also talk about the fact that big ag and big chemical companies are already meddling in the issues. The bigger issue is also that we need to decentralize everything. In climate change, we will have to decentralize energy production, food production, all of that to make it far more localized and therefore cutting down on all the fossil fuels that are associated with it.
So, Karina mentioned resources. I know Lauren's going to share a bunch of links with everybody here after this, and there's some really great articles and research that our panelists have shared. She'll have a chance to look at that, and want to encourage you. Oh, and she just put that up in the chat, which is great. And also want to encourage you all, if you've got questions, just please put them in the chat. So I also want to, in thinking about the film and what they got right, I'm curious, our two sort of land managers here, Tom and Jeff, when you were seeing the film and the stories of the people that were actually engaging in these regenerative practices, right? We had the young woman who was ranching in Washington State, I believe, and then the story about the regeneration of the valley in China. As someone who's working on the landscape, were any of those stories and what they were talking about in terms of the practice itself and the power of regenerative agriculture resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over the years, we've taken a fairly degraded land base here and using the best science we could possibly have at the time, trying to emulate some of those practices that were being pushed. And even the time that I've been here, the change in what we've seen is not as obviously as glaring as what we saw in the Chinese Valley, which was amazing. But it does give hope. The world is not going to mind if we're here or not. It's going to keep going. And I think that if we can live within the system that's already here better and learn from the lessons that are already out there. So that's what these people are doing. They're reading the land, they're saying, how can we improve upon how we're using it? So yes, it was very inspirational from that perspective that, the earth doesn't care if humans are here or not. The plants are going to keep growing, animals are going to keep going. Well, it's also because it doesn't get too hot. But in general, it was very inspiring from that perspective.
Yeah, it was funny. This morning we had county naturalists in Burlington County led a bird walk at our farm. And to me, that crystallizes what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, we're trying to grow a lot of food, healthy food, delicious food, chemical-free food, and I think we can do that. We're trying to show that you can do that, and also do things like plant trees, mix in a lot of perennials, improve the health of your soil, not spray Roundup and herbicides. So the challenge, I think, I know I've worked with a lot of young farmers. When I was at Fernbrook, we had 30 apprentices in my time there. And the pure, sometimes cruel economics of running a farm can be just tough. You know, I'm partnered with a nonprofit here with the Pinelands Preservation Alliance who, you know, they acquired this 70-acre soybean farm. It's been in conventional soybeans for 40 plus years. And as of last year, you know, we're starting this regenerative venture. And, you know, you can, starting a farm is a great way to dump $500,000. It's tough. And, you know, I'm lucky that I have a partner, you know, we still, so, you know, I don't want this to be a demonstration farm so much as a farm that shows that we can support ourselves economically, but realizing that that's one of the big challenges is, you know, I was really proud to see those farmers in the movie making it, but the finances, I know some really, really hardworking, smart, dedicated farmers who are just having a tough time making it work, you know? So I don't know, that's a piece of the puzzle we probably need to talk about too, and is getting, how do we support farmers who are trying to do these things? You know, how do we make it economically viable?
Yeah. So any thoughts on that? I mean, so I think it was Karina who touched on it, like just the, or maybe it was you, Jeff, the disproportionate amount of resources that go to continue these industrialized agricultural practices, right? It makes it difficult for the farmer, right? But we also can't have a romanticized vision of who farmers are. A lot of farmers are large corporate entities, you know, controlling massive acreages of land.
Yeah, sure. I would just say, you know, having government policies, support, and I think maybe that's coming more, but you know, here we've gotten cost share money to put in a well and a deer fence and a high tunnel, and you know, things that there's money for solar on farms. So I think just, you know, providing resources for, you know, the FSA can be great, a great way for a young farmer to get a low interest long-term mortgage, things like that, just the nuts and bolts. But yeah, having state and federal policies that are going to support non-commodity farmers, I guess, you know.
Yeah. So I'm curious from Stephanie and Karina. So what are you seeing in terms of, you know, there's some policies out there right now. This language of natural climate solutions is in a lot of like bold, ambitious plans right now, right? In terms of meeting goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But do you see this science there to support, like, what are the practices that farmers and landowners need to start turning to? And is there science to support that?
I think a lot of what is proposed can be done. I think especially going back to the last conversation, we have to realize there's differences in scale. You know, here in New Jersey, we tend to have relatively small farms, and they tend to be more, vegetable production or, you know, more for local use, as opposed to those Midwestern farms that are, you know, thousands of acres, and they are concentrating on corn and soybeans and so forth. We don't have so much of that here. And so that affects what can be done. And I think in that sense, our smaller scale farms here that I would imagine, I'm pretty sure would be more on the, you know, family farm level as opposed to corporate farming, it's more feasible to do some of the things that are recommended, such as the cover cropping, you know, always keeping the surface covered and keeping living roots in the ground throughout the season. That's one of the reasons for the cover crops, as well as maintaining the nutrients, within the plant and recycling those nutrients in a very tight cycle certainly helps to conserve resources. So we're not wasting. We don't need to apply as much fertilizers, for example, if we're conserving those nutrients and putting that carbon back in the soil through those roots and through all of the microbes and other organisms that live in the soil that are dependent on those roots living in the soil. We have sources of organic matter like food waste is one of them, composted food waste. We have leaves from trees. That's something feasible to do in a lot of farms here in New Jersey that may not be feasible, in those huge farms out in Iowa, for example. So we do have some things that we can do. I have some other things listed here, but Karina, did you want to?
Well, I mean,
jump in
something
there?
that you also mentioned earlier, Steph, is simply no tilling, right? So a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if you wish, would already be no-till agriculture by maintaining some of the soil aggregates and not basically digging up the carbon. And
Absolutely. Yeah. When you till the soil, or any disturbance of the soil, you're exposing it to the air, which stimulates some of that degradation of the organic matter. And so we're actually losing more carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere when you till the soil because of its that organic matter being in the soil undisturbed is a way of protecting it. And thus
Stephanie,
we use that word sequestering. Yes.
sorry, Stephanie and Karina, that brings up an interesting question because almost all the no-till is conventional no-till, which means, you grow the winter rye or the cover crop and then you kill it with Roundup and then no-till drill into that. So, that is better in my opinion than conventional plowing and disking and putting your corn or your soybeans in. However, it's a big question. Is conventional no-till really, is it an improvement? Is it, because there's not a whole lot. Organic no-till is usually done mechanically with big roller crimpers. And it's not actually done that commonly as far as I know, maybe Tom or someone. But that it's an interesting topic how do people feel about conventional no-till farming?
Well, I think that's one thing that some people don't realize, that there's that trade-off. If we say, don't till your soil, do you realize that means that the farmer's probably going to be using pesticides and as I said, there's more than one reason to till. In the movie, they said people till the soil to plant seeds. Well, one of the big reasons that farmers till is for weed control. So if we don't till, then how are we going to be controlling those weeds? So I think that's one thing a lot of people don't realize. It is kind of a dilemma or some kind of a trade-off. But you're right. There's other ways, like the roller crimper, which for anybody that doesn't know, it basically smashes the cover crop to try to kill it without using any chemicals. Maybe Tom can actually describe that a little better. We had one a couple of years ago, right? At Duke Farms.
We've been working with one for the past 4 years, testing it. We're getting a little better every year. It's trickier. There's a fine line between when you do it, when you actually crimp it. We use rye, and we're just trying. We've been trialing it. We have not actually used it. I think this year we may actually use it to try some crops through it. So the idea is you break the rye to the ground, and it covers the ground and smothers any weeds that come up, and you can plant with a skinny slit in the middle of it without, to keep your weed pressure down. I know Rodale's done a lot of it, and their executive director has done years of it up in Pennsylvania. So it does work for certain crops really well, but you have to really, really fine tune it. And again, it's going to be at a smaller scale, as to Stephanie's point about, it'll work in these northeastern smaller, farms much more readily than out in the Midwest where they have gigantic fields of corn and soy. That's a whole different discussion, I think.
And what you said is right, is, there's that learning curve, and also think about the fact that now the farmer, if he wants to go that route, needs some new equipment.
Right.
So there's a lot of, I don't want to say barriers, but there's a lot of things to deal with. It's not a simple switch over.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I quickly want to add, and since also Lauren put in buy local, buy fresh, if we move back a step and say, in terms of climate change, what can I do with my food choices, for example? Ironically, if you buy conventional local, it has got a lower carbon footprint than if you buy organic California, that has then to be transported a long ways in terms of carbon footprint. So the carbon basically that you save of having it organic is overcompensated by spending the carbon on the transportation, which is also a bit ironic that an apple from New Zealand has a lower carbon footprint than an apple from Maine that is trucked in compared to being shipped in, because shipping an apple is having a lower carbon footprint. So if we take those sorts of considerations also back, getting to the more local one that does not have as much of a transportation footprint associated with it, you are doing better for the planet than having something organic that comes from a long way. Which then also leads me to a comment that Jeff made earlier by voting with your dollar. The unfortunate part with voting with the dollar is that those who have the most money will make the most vote. So it's not necessarily the ones that we think should be voting, which is everybody equally. So we have a little bit of a disincentive when we have the big dollars voting, which we see who's basically running the show is the biggest lobbyist. So when we say voting with a dollar, we are giving the vote to those who have the most money. So I caution a little bit with that.
Yeah, but still, I mean, like we're starting our first year as a CSA here, community supported agriculture. So if people are taking just a small percentage of their overall food budget every year and buying a CSA share, that can make a real difference to a local grower. And also, the big companies notice those 1%, 2%, 3% changes in buying habits, and that can affect them to try to catch up. So, I think you're right. People with the most money probably have the most ability to affect change, but there's a lot of, collectively, I think if everybody kind of moves in the same direction, even people in all socioeconomic ranges can make a pretty big difference that way. And can I just dovetail one more thing? That I am a bit of a composting fanatic. I admit it. My name's Jeff, and I love to compost. But I do think that is one of the ways that we can make such a difference and do it relatively quickly. I was so glad to see them spotlight the composting in San Francisco, and they're doing it in other places in California and other places in the country. And up to 40% of our waste stream is compostable. And rather than incinerate it, landfill it, that can be a real asset to farms, even larger farms potentially. And that's where maybe policies paying farms. So we do this weird hippie thing called Project Pizza Box. So we have, we collect pizza boxes in Bordentown, New Jersey. We have 3 bins now, and we collect about 200 pizza boxes a week because they don't recycle them. All the research that we've done, they're generally safe to use in soils and in agriculture, and in fact are approved for use in organic production in most cases. And we use them in mulching. We mulch trees, we mulch tomato walkways, And that's cool because it's a participatory thing. People love putting their pizza boxes, in the bin, and we collect 200 a week, but we're not getting paid for it. We're just doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's, how about a deposit every time you buy a pizza that, that money goes to a farmer who is composting rather than incinerating. I mean, there's all kinds of composting. I think opens up so many avenues where we can affect on both ends of this problem a positive change.
Jeff, I think you just inspired a lot of our audience members to think about how they can set
To
up
go
a
get pizza tonight?
Pizza box.
pizza box in their community. That's a great idea. Karina, I'm curious, can you help? So someone in the chat asked, how do you measure the size of a carbon footprint? Like what is I know that's a complicated question, but is there a general overview you can provide us in terms of, as a scientist, what you're calculating?
Well, carbon footprint, you can actually Google. I just Googled actually a bunch of carbon footprint calculators that are online. What I have personally shared just now is actually research. Those are scientific journal articles that usually are behind a paywall, but some of them are now also freely accessible. But if you want to know your own carbon footprint, then you can do a calculation with carbon footprint calculators that are available from the Nature Conservancy, from EPA, conservation. There are various of them, and a lot of factors go in there. Just a little quick narrative. In one of my classes, I had a student calculating if she travels to Iceland, since she likes to travel a lot, how much of beef she would have to cut down in order to compensate for that. We know that there's a lot of times in these carbon trading that you can buy carbon offsets, which is another ballpark, and they talk about carbon trading also in a movie briefly, but that's another ball of wax that I want to not get into. But quickly, so she would have to give up beef for 2 years in order to actually compensate for her trip to Iceland. So there's a lot of considerations if you really want to get into the carbon footprint story. What actually, and flying is really one of the biggest personal carbon footprints. However, since we talked also about nature-based solutions, 25% of the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere is simply that we cut down forests. So if we just stop tomorrow cutting any forest down, and that's Amazon, ironically, we are cutting down tropical forests in Indonesia to plant palm oil, which is then biodiesel. We want to be green and hippie, and we are actually destroying more. But that's, again, another issue here. But that is right there and then, 25% of our carbon emissions would be stopped if we stop deforestation. So there's a lot in a bigger climate change and carbon footprint story that you need to consider. There are actually some companies that even put the carbon footprint onto the bottles. You can buy a bottle of wine and it tells you exactly what the carbon footprint is. So there is plenty of options to do that research. But carbon footprint calculators are also available online. They are not super scientific, but it gives you a little bit of a hint and can also be used as a teaching tool.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I also appreciated that message being reinforced in the film somewhat when they had Paul Hawken, the author of Drawdown, speaking about how if we just stopped doing some of the things that we're doing right now, we could have some real gains here. But really, I'd love you all to sort of weigh in on this question that is sort of looming for me, which is, this film does a really good job of showcasing regenerative agriculture as part of the solution, right? But how does it fit? Like, it cannot be the only solution, right? Like, how does it fit into this bigger puzzle here in terms of really reducing and reversing global warming and the climate crisis? It can't be just the only solution.
No, the paper I referred to from 2018, it was titled Natural Climate Solutions is for the United States. It was done by 38 authors, like I talked about, and they picked three major habitat types, basically, or land bases: forest, ag lands, and wetlands. And they give you like how much these natural climate solutions. They picked 21 different categories within those three areas, and discuss what can be done. And like I said before, reforestation, to Karina's point, and lack of deforestation is the biggest. I mean, not even close to anything else. So I think we need to start looking at where are those big areas we can make big changes without too much effort. And I think Stephanie brought up cover crops. When you look at agriculture, it's right behind ag conversion of grasslands as how much we can sequester, but it's just by using cover crops. And it's actually the cheapest of all the things that we can do within agriculture. And basically, just all it is covering your soil for 365 days a year, or as much as possible. So I think the science is out there to draw off of. The error bars are larger within the ag community because we don't know as much about, to the soil scientist point, and Karina's point. It takes a while for soil to change. So we haven't been studying the regenerative agricultural soils long enough to understand how our practices are being, how they're working. In full disclosure, we are working with Stephanie and Karina on a project here at Duke Farms to get to that point, including our carbon footprint for the whole organization. We're looking at forests, wetlands, and ag lands to see how our management is impacting sequestration of carbon. So we're hoping to be part of that error bar shrinking in this research.
And Tom, do you want to mention the deer effect too? Somebody had asked about the hooved animals and how that relates. So I thought maybe you want to add something about the deer part of the
Sure.
Duke Farms project.
Absolutely. So natural climate solutions are, like I said, they're like 21% of what we can do in the United States to sequester carbon, and the bulk of that is increasing our biomass, our plant biomass. And one of our biggest hindrances, and believe it or not, the northeastern forest or the eastern forest sequester 85% of the United States' carbon, not the big forests of the west, the eastern forest. And where we're seeing the biggest impact of these herbivores on our forest is in the east. So it's unfortunate. A lot of these young forest practitioners will say that's where all the carbon's being created, but that's not true. It's not exactly linear, and you can't really say one is better than the other. It's more of a long plateau, and therefore having deer, I'm having feedback here. Having deer being overabundant is really stalling all those processes in the forest patches that'll get us to these points that we need to make and have healthy forests. Healthy forests do sequester more carbon than ruderal forests that are open to tons of invasive plants and too much sunlight, and that is shown in some literature that's come out recently within the region.
Also, overabundant deer and out of balance deer population impacting agriculture as well. One of those other economic impacts for farmers in keeping their operations going.
30% of soybean, 30% losses by most soybean farmers in New Jersey, just from deer. That's substantial.
Yeah. Lauren asked, again, Karina, you sort of touched on this, but anything else you want to add? There is this sort of perception that cows are really bad when it comes to the climate. And yet part of these natural system solutions involve cows and hooved animals. So what are the trade-offs related to cows and hooved animals here in this puzzle?
Well, I mean, the trade-off, so you can also say it's a trade-off. If you graze, you save on methane, which is, depending on how you want to calculate the greenhouse gas burden on it, between 23 and 85. So you would save on methane. I mean, in general, if we go down the path of agriculture, changing our ways, we will need, ecologically speaking, move towards a more plant-based diet. And I'm saying that very slowly because nobody wants to hear that they should eat less burgers, right? But that is a part of the solution, will have to be not only changing agriculture itself, but also our diets. And there's also
the regeneration diet that they mentioned in the film.
Yes, so there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and I know this is very unpopular if people are being told what to eat, so to speak, but again, it is really part of the puzzle. Will that be too? And I would argue, since I don't eat meat, I cannot tell, but my other half would tell you that beef raised with grass tastes better than in the cattle lot. So Tom is giving thumbs up. So, I mean, there's a lot of trade-offs back and forth. You have less methane, you have better, healthier cows, you regenerate the soil, but you can also do that with sheep and goats. So it doesn't have to be cows. So, and they are less ruminants. So
yeah, so regenerative diet, more plants. If you're going to eat meat that is pasture raised, grass,
and less of it.
less of it.
And
yeah.
less McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King.
So Jeff, I'm curious what you would recommend. I mean, these are big system challenges, right? And I think oftentimes individual choice is overemphasized in terms of how we're really going to get to solutions. However, people do look for ways that they can make an impact in their everyday choices. So what would you recommend to the consumer in terms of what are the questions they should be asking their farmer to know whether they're supporting a farmer that's really embracing these kinds of practices?
Wow, that's a big one you threw at me. Well, I think just getting to know, like with the CSA, the idea is that the individual, the family is involved with their farm. Sometimes they volunteer, they come to events, or they just come to the farm to get their food, pick their flowers, be involved somehow. And I think just asking, so we're not certified organic. I don't know that we're going to be. I think I'm not opposed to the organic label at all. And I think there's quite a bit of merit in people searching for organic produce and organic goods. But I always feel like that direct contact with people at the farm, they can ask questions, they can see how their food is raised. I mean, we have some pastured pigs that we raise. And, that's good because seeing pigs out on pasture, I know people who are more vegetarian who end up buying pork because they appreciate how it was raised. And I know people who love to eat pork, but won't buy our pork because they got to know the pigs, which is a little strange. But, I think it's just being there, and it helps people being on a farm, think about the choices you make, the food you eat. And, I was a vegetarian for 10 years. I think it's a very great way to go. Now I try to just source meat that is, sustainably raised. And, I think there's no one answer, but just to try. I think that's, it goes back to my earlier sentiment is that, people have to give a crap and know that this is a problem, and then challenge themselves to do something and talk to their farmer, or, again, if you're in a supermarket, I guess the way to do it is to read labels and try to purchase organic and, where is this food coming from? It's tough because we're all trying to get by and,
Well, I
anyway.
think, so it's really about that relationship. What's your relationship with food and the people that grow your food and produce your food? And do you even have a relationship? Is it possible for you to develop that relationship? I think speaks a lot to what Sustainable Jersey is trying to do, right? Like connect communities with the information and tools they need to start rebuilding those local systems. So Lauren, we're at about 7:58. I just want to turn it over to you to see if there's any questions that you see that didn't get answered, or any follow-up and next steps you want to share with the audience.
our panelists have been doing a great job answering the questions that they've been coming in. We haven't had too many questions. So I would invite folks to, post a question in the chat if you have anything. But we're going to send a follow-up email. Sorry, I don't have my video on. We're going to send a follow-up email, with those resources that I had posted earlier in the chat, and also some connections to some of the Sustainable Jersey actions that are related to some of what we've talked about tonight. So I just wanted to give a big, applause to all of our speakers, and to Margaret, thank you for moderating. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here tonight. I learned a lot. I wish that we could, do this for every movie, every documentary that we watch, just to gather some experts and talk a little bit more about.
I feel like the next time you do a film about regenerative farming, we need to be in person and eating food.
Yes, eating Jeff's food.
Yeah, maybe we could host an outdoor viewing or something at the farm. I think that, things are loosening up. I think that would be great.
Oh, I love that idea.
I volunteer to do it.
All right, details to come. All right, thank you.
We'll bring the pasture-raised beef.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I know it was a beautiful night, so thank you for being with us for, the past hour and taking the time. We appreciate you joining us. So take care and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks again to our panelists.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.